So hello, everybody. We're just going to wait a few minutes here, or a minute or two, just to let people filter in, and then we'll get started. Oh, Emma, can you make sure to hit the recording button?
Yeah, it's already started.
Okay, perfect. Just going to wait one more minute here. Okay, well, I think we can get started. We're just 1 minute past the bottom of the hour, but we can get started, and more people are going to be filtering in. So welcome. My name is Jeff Geipel. I'm with the Mining Shared Value Initiative of Engineers Without Borders, and with the World Bank and their Energy and Extractives practice, we manage the extractives-led local economic diversification community of practice, which is a nice way of saying looking at how we can maximize local content in extractive industry host countries, help policymakers and practitioners diversify economies, and now increasingly how we can address the green transition and all of that. So today we have a webinar. We tend to have webinars sort of, every 2 to 3 months, depending on the year, and we're going to have another one hopefully in a month's time on oil and gas. But the webinars are one of our many offerings in terms of trying to push the discussion forward on how to manage these issues better. And I think today's topic is really exciting because we're talking about measurement of local content. And, for the last decade in particular, there's been a huge push by extractive industry host countries, as well as companies, to try to get more local procurement, more local hiring, and these kinds of things. But measurement has been kind of drifting behind in terms of its sophistication. So we always say you can't manage what you don't measure, and today's topic is about how we can measure local content better to manage it better. So we've got a few practitioners. One, we have Rob Pittman from the Natural Resource Governance Institute to really set the scene as to why this is important. They have done some great work at the NRGI on why there should be more transparency in extractive industry procurement. And today he's going to focus it on some of the tools that some governments are using. Then we're going to have Johannes Lohmeyer from GIZ, who's going to present another, or shall we say, a framework or a tool which is being used on measuring local content and specifically local procurement. He's actually presenting the mining local procurement reporting mechanism, which is something that we ourselves have worked on, but obviously we are moderators, so we can't host and speak. So we've had Johannes step up from GIZ as the commissioning agency for the LPRM. And lastly, we have Mabola Sandy from DEI, our friends, who have a rather sophisticated way of approaching measurement of local content and helping partners manage it. So we're really excited to hear about their kind of next level of detail down in terms of really managing this better using measurement. So we're really excited to have you all here. Thank you all. Some housekeeping. You have a chat function, so people can put questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. Once we do open the Q&A, we will also allow people to hit the raise hand icon, and then we can call on you to speak. It's always nice to have a few questions verbally, but we'll make sure to get all the questions that we can. To be honest, every one of these webinars, we usually have to cut off discussion because of the high caliber of attendee, that there's always a really good discussion, but we will do our best to get to all of them, and we can arrange for follow-ups and after online on the community of practice itself. For those who are attending but are not a member of the ELLED community practice, you can contact us to request membership, and we'll make sure you're invited, which is basically open for anyone who works in local content in terms of practitioners, government, companies, bilaterals. Everybody's welcome as long as you work in this topic. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of an introduction. And I'm really excited to hand over to our colleague Rob from the NRGI to sort of set the scene as to why measuring local content and why transparency in procurement specifically is such an important issue for extractive governance. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff. Right, can I have presenter's privileges, please?
There you go.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk with you about these exciting topics. I'm going to base my presentation on a report that we at NRGI produced last year. It's called Beneath the Surface, and it provides the case for why we need more oversight and more transparency for extractive industry suppliers. The sort of the general agenda. Why are my slides not moving? Can I just? The agenda of my presentation is going to be in three parts. So I'm going to start by covering some of the key messages of the report. Next, I'm going to look into three issues in supplier governance that I think will hopefully, frame a number of issues that we'll want to dig into in the discussion later on. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's being done and what comes next. So let's go into these key messages. The first of the key messages that we have essentially that there's a huge amount of money spent on extractive industry suppliers, but they keep a very low profile. Using industry sources, we estimate that around about $1 trillion a year was spent on suppliers each year pre-pandemic. And if you map that spending onto gross revenues at the project level, you can get a sense of how big supplier spending is as a sort of a proportion of all financial flows. And if you look in the mining sector, spending on suppliers is around 45% of growth revenues. So that's the largest segment, larger than spending on employees and overhead, larger than investor return, and larger than government take. In the petroleum sector, that proportion is slightly smaller, 26%. But the pie in general in the petroleum sector is much larger. So you're looking at around about $800 billion spent per year in petroleum and around about 160 plus in the mining sector. And because of how much is spent, there's a huge amount at stake for citizens. And the way that this spending has impact and public interest impacts is on project costs, government revenues, local content, and corruption. Clearly, and Jeff mentioned this, the energy transition is a big sort of external force that is affecting the extractive sector at the moment. Also, new technologies are as well, and these big changes provide new opportunities, but they also provide threats. And I think, especially in the mining sector, there is going to be an urgency to set things straight before new investments come on board. Finally, our conclusion is that transparency is an important first step. And here, there's a good news message that ad hoc progress is being made. But we definitely identify that a coordination challenge remains. So let's go into these supplier governance issues. As I want to sort of flag firstly that there are three of these that we're going to cover quite quickly, hopefully. First is cost control. Second is local procurement. And third is corruption. So let's jump into cost control. I think the point to start with here is that governments and rights holders have a shared interest here in keeping costs low. The rights holders want to keep costs low to make sure that they have greater profits, and the governments want costs to be low to have a larger tax base. Yet, cost overruns are very common. Here's a couple of reports from 2014-15 flagging 2/3 of mega projects in the mining sector and the petroleum sector have cost overruns. And similar reports have been made more recently. Most of the reasons for these overruns are internal commercial decision making. But there are certain issues that I think are of public interest. And I'm just going to quickly highlight three of these now. The first is when non-commercial agendas enter procurement decision making. And these can be for totally legitimate reasons. One of the reasons is, the decision to spend money on local procurement or boost local employment. But they can also be for illegitimate reasons, such as corruption. So, that's the first one. The important thing is we need to know what are these non-commercial agendas, ideally. The second point is use of related parties. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth here, but this is a pretty well-established topic. But essentially, spending on suppliers can be used to shift profits from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions. And a third potential public interest concern relating to costs is when suppliers have increased negotiation power. This happens when supplier oligopolies or monopolies form. And so, having an understanding of supplier market segments allows governments, regulators to identify when this happens. So let's move on to the second point, local procurement. And I think this is the focus of many of the people on this call today. Let's start with the promise of local procurement. Everybody wants local procurement for multiple different reasons. Governments want to stimulate local jobs, businesses, and wealth. Companies want a social license to operate, and everybody wants resilient supply chains that can withstand global shocks. And I think that's become all the more apparent with the COVID crisis in the last couple of years. All of this means that people are putting together local procurement policies. Governments are doing it, companies are doing it. And there are huge expectations. But the question I have is this realistic? There's been new research from the IGF, a series called New Tech, New Deal. And they identified some interesting sort of dynamics in the mining sector. Automation and remote work mean high risk for low and semi-skilled occupations that tend to be the occupations that are the focus of local procurement. And while new jobs may be created, the key tension is that the jobs created might not be in the mining affected areas. And in some instances, this is going to mean that there's a shifting locus of value along the value chain for foreign providers of new technologies and information services. And so maybe local procurement policies are going to be hitting essentially a sinking target. And we're seeing similar trends in the petroleum sector. This is a Wall Street Journal article highlighting that drillers are going remote at the moment. And I think all of this means that there is a real need to communicate local content effectively to make sure that that the expectations are well managed. And I think with that in mind, it's really disappointing that when you look at most company reporting on local content and local procurement spending, the reporting is really disappointing. There's a reliance on narrative reporting, and where figures are provided, usually the wider context, such as percentage of the total spend, is not given. And we identify three areas of transparency that would really help in sort of making more effective transparency, accountability around this local procurement spending. And those are, firstly, being clear about how you define local. Second, being clear about your targets and how they're developed, monitored, and enforced. And finally, being clear about who is making the decisions and how the interests of local elites are sort of essentially managed. And that brings us on to our third issue, and that issue is corruption. Suppliers are an important node for corruption in the extractive industries. We see that through a basic analysis of FCPA proceedings in the USA. we see that the extractive industries are the largest source of SEPA cases around the world. And we see that supplier transparency, supplier corruption issues predominate in that subset. I'm just going to quickly talk about sort of 4 of the drivers that we identified. First is that suppliers will pay bribes essentially to gain rewards or advantage in particular supplier deals. Companies use suppliers to pay bribes themselves or hide channels of influence that they have. Political elites may manipulate supplier contracting for their own purposes, for example, patronage. And finally, you see economic elites using their power and connections to tilt the field towards their own company. So, and with all of that in mind, I just want to move on to what's being done and what comes next. And before I do go into some examples, I just want to tear out some common themes. Firstly, despite the size and spending on suppliers, there's very little information here. And this means that it's very difficult to determine the scale of the benefits and challenges, the policies that are working and those that aren't, and who's performing well and who isn't. So transparency is a necessary first step. And we're not just saying this because, you know, this is a knee-jerk reaction. We have examples where supplier transparency has actually improved oversight. I just want to give you 3 quickly now. Firstly, in Cameroon, when local civil society organizations used information about supplier spending to monitor company compliance with contractual obligations to procure from local sources. In Iraq, increased sort of scrutiny of suppliers by the EITI process resulted in the identification of a petroleum supplier that hadn't registered in country, and that had significant sort of tax potential tax fallout. And then a third example is in Ukraine, where when it became public how much the local state-owned enterprise had spent on a gas rig, civil society groups and journalists started exploring and trying to understand the deal more. And in doing so, they unearthed a scandal in which the SOE had paid a significant amount more than the price of the rig that had just been sold or flipped by another company just sort of months previously. And so those are some examples of how suppliers transparency are being used. I just want to now sort of give us the good news that companies and governments are already producing a lot of information. They're producing information in 4 main areas, and we identify these and sort of dig into them a bit more detail in the report. But the areas are, they're providing information about their procurement processes. They're providing information about the identities of the suppliers that they are bringing on. They're providing information on the spending on suppliers, how much of that is spent locally, how much of that is spent globally. And they're providing, in some cases, especially through the EITI processes, we're understanding how much suppliers are contributing towards tax. And then there are sort of global standards that are being produced on this. The mining local procurement reporting mechanism, which we're going to hear more about after this presentation, is producing a set of standards here. And that's a really important starting point, I think, for many companies and governments that want to start working on this. There's conversations going on within EITI about ways that that transparency of suppliers can be brought into EITI. And then there are other standards of reporting and transparency that touch on these things. The Open Contracting Data Standard talks about sort of government procurement that applies as well to SOEs. And things like the GRI also touch on these things. So I now just want to end with some concrete examples. Here's from Qatar Petroleum, an SOE. You can see on their tender pages, they provide information about all sorts of things about tenders, from the upcoming tenders to contracts and details about the contracts that have been awarded. But it's not just limited to SOEs. We are seeing normal private sector companies also providing detailed information about procurement. Here's a page from the Oyo Tolgoi procurement portal on their website. And this is a listing of all the contracts awarded by the mine. This is a mine in Mongolia. And we have all sorts of information about the suppliers that win these awards. And interestingly as well, they provide information in addition to the company name, details about a contact person in those suppliers that that local companies can contact to find out about further subcontracting opportunities. In the UK, the Oil and Gas Authority has set up a really spectacular website that all companies operating in the petroleum sector have to put their procurement information on. This includes information on upcoming tenders, and it includes information as well on contracts awarded. And again, you'll see contractor names and then information about contactees. Another thing to note with this website is it also includes information about collaboration opportunities. So that's an interesting sort of next level sort of type of information out there that allows companies to go away and think about how they can work together. A final government example that I just wanted to highlight, it's because it's so spectacular, is the Lebanese Petroleum Administration. They have provided information about contractors, and in addition to that, they also provide information on the beneficial owners of those contractors, and this allows us to sort of think about some of these corruption and conflict of interest issues. And finally, another really good example for those of you who are interested in how to sort of put down information about local procurement spending versus global and international spending on procurement, comes from EITI Senegal, and they have detailed Excel tables that accompany their EITI reporting. They have one whole page that looks at local contractors, and then another that looks at international contractors, and for each project they'll have a number of contractors and the amount spent on those contractors. So just some final thoughts. First, I just want to make it very clear that we need procurement and supplier information to make good supplier governance decisions. Secondly, private sector and government initiatives show us what's possible and provide some cause for optimism. But we face a coordination challenge to make these disclosures more widespread, consistent, and useful. And that's why initiatives like the local procurement reporting mechanism are so important. Also, these discussions within EITI and other reporting standards too. So thanks very much. There's my email. I'll put a link to the report in the chat. And I look forward very much to the other presentations and to the discussion that follows.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. That remains a really fantastic job sort of setting the why as to why procurement reporting and local content measurement is more important to begin with. So with that in mind, we're going to hand over right to the mining LPRM and an example practical tool to deal with this. So Johannes from GIZ. There we go.
Yes, thank you for the introduction and also for sharing the slides. Sorry, some technical difficulties here on my side. I hope you can also hear me well. And no objections, okay, then I'll continue. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to present the LPRM today. I think the tool connects very well to the motto of the invitation, what I think was what is measured is managed. And in the coming minutes, I'm going to present you some key elements of the LPRM, a tool to assess local content impact. Next slide, please. Before I start with the LPRM, let me briefly mention that I work as an advisor in the GIZ sector program Extractives and Development at GIZ's headquarters in Germany. As you probably know, GIZ is a service provider in the field of international cooperation for sustainable development, with our main commissioning party, the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, or in short BMZ. Our sector program, Extractives and Development, is now in its third project phase, and we are closely cooperating with the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources, BGR. And the goal of our program is to advise the BMZ to contribute globally to good governance in the extractive sector by developing approaches that are implemented in the national and international policy dialogue. And the LPRM, I think, is a good example here. Next slide, please. In the extractive sector, GIZ is active in 28 countries right now, with a focus on West and Central Africa, as well as the Andean region in South America. And apart from bilateral and regional programs on the ground, we have a global program, CONNEX, that you might know, that supports partner countries in the negotiation of complex investments, predominantly mining contracts. Next slide, please. Now let me turn to the aspect of mining and economic growth, which is also the motive behind the engagement of German Development Cooperation. The Agenda 2030 defines inclusive growth as a key sustainable development goal in SDG 8. Mining is a major economic driver in many of the resource-rich partner countries, as we heard from Rob, and it can have direct impacts through the generation of jobs or the purchase of goods and services by the mine. A multiplier effect can start by suppliers purchasing goods and services, and we have the induced impact through goods and services purchased at the household level by mine employees. And in an ideal case, this leads to spillover effects to other economic sectors and the diversification of the economy, as well as technological upgrading. Next slide, please. Yeah, Rob already mentioned big contracts, low profile, and the potential of the mining sector to contribute to the aims of the Agenda 2030 is also reflected by the figure Rob mentioned, and also by this figure here, which is showing among the member companies of the World Gold Council, we can see that these local suppliers of goods and services being by far the biggest recipients of host country investments or spending, accounting for 71% of in-country expenditure. Next slide, please. Let me briefly also touch on the challenges that are associated with mining and economic development. First of all, we have the little perceived economic benefit of mining projects for local communities that can lead to frustration, even conflicts, and endanger the social license. And this is especially crucial as the mining sector is extremely capital intensive. And these investments generate expectations for economic development on national, regional, and also local levels. And the weak local procurement can be the result of a lack of data. This is where we come to the LPRM in a second. The lack of information about the procurement process itself, about the procurement demand, and so on. So the question is, how is the local business supposed to know about specific demands of a mine, for example? And yeah, at the very end, it's crucial to understand the limits and opportunities of mining's economic impacts. Next slide, please. Yeah, now let me come to the tool. The LPRM was created by the Mining Shared Value Initiative of Engineers Without Borders Canada, with support of GIZ, commissioned by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Over the course of 1.5 years, MSB experts consulted with governments, companies, and also civil society organizations to align on a standard with a range of requirements that was finally launched in 2017. You can access it via the QR code here, or I'm pretty sure we can also post the link to the tool in the chat in a second. Next slide, please. To ensure the broad and also inclusive engagement of the global mining industry and its stakeholders, In the creation of the set of disclosures, MSV began a consultation process to incorporate the insights of mining companies, host country suppliers, governments, civil society, and other institutions. And now let's come to the LPRM. So what's the LPRM? It is a set of disclosures on local procurement by the mining industry. It seeks to address the gaps in current reporting frameworks and sustainability systems and to help standardize the way the sector and host countries talk about these issues. And in just a few words, for the LPRM, mining companies are reporting on quantitative and qualitative data regarding local procurement to mining company stakeholders and rights holders. And it is also very important that this data must be openly accessible to the public. And let me also remark that this is it is the goal of having the LPRM included in CSR and governance frameworks that are already existing. It's rather the integration and not to set up a new separate system like ELTI or whatever. I mean, there are already a lot of initiatives existing. So next slide, please. To further elicit guidance, the Global Steering Committee of senior officials representing different stakeholder groups was created. And the committee consisted of members, as you can see, representing mining companies, mining industry associations, suppliers, governments, civil society, and others. Yeah, next slide, please. The LPRM has three core objectives. First of all, to improve the internal management in mining companies, to create more benefits for host countries, and to strengthen their social license to operate. Second, to empower suppliers, host governments, and other stakeholders with practical information that will help them collaborate with mine sites. And third, to increase transparency in the procurement process to deter problematic practices such as corruption that Rob mentioned. Next slide, please. So the LPRM contains of 6 aspects from LPRM 100 to 600 of local procurement disclosures. For example, covering the context or the local procurement spending by category and some others. And in total, the LPRM contains 22 disclosures. 13 of them are required disclosures, and the rest, the nine remaining disclosures are voluntary or encouraged. And accordance with the LPRM, as you can see on the right side here, is based on the following 2 aspects. First, for a given mine site, all required disclosures are reported by the reporting organization. And second, significant efforts are made by the reporting organization to ensure that reported information is accurate, regularly updated, and accessible to all relevant stakeholders. Next slide, please. Now we come to the measurement. One of the key developments over the last decade is that governments and companies have realized they need to have much more sophisticated measurement of their local content impacts that go far beyond just the simple mentioning of the number of jobs and the dollar amount for procurement. And because, I mean, the reason behind that is that not all procurement dollars are equal. Spending that goes to locally owned and managed suppliers manufacturing products creates not only more economic development for host countries, but also helps mining companies to secure their social license to operate. As we can see on the upper right, supplier D is locally owned, and this is quite a good example. A foreign-owned importer of goods, for example, like supplier 8 on the bottom left in this matrix, creates very little value for host countries. So what the LPRM wants is to promote procurement and supplier development to support suppliers like supplier D. And this matrix, which is, by the way, drawn from also a World Bank West African local procurement guide. Next slide, please. If companies do not have the right measurements in place and do not create multiple categories of suppliers to track against, they can overestimate the goods they are creating for host countries. And this is a real social license risk at the end. governments too need to understand the real value created for procurement so they can tailor policy towards the right types of procurement spending. And this is quite a good example of a mining company using the LPRM, creating the sophistication needed to truly understand their impacts and inform their efforts at local procurement and supplier development. Teranga Gold, which since this report came out was purchased by Endeavour Mining, which is, by the way, now also using the LPRM. They produced this table for their 2019 sustainability report. And as you can see, they have created multiple categories of suppliers and, for example, split up nationally owned versus subsidiaries of international companies. And they have even also broken up the goods and services into broad categories on the left side. This level of measurement allows them to understand their impacts and determine where to target. And with this level of detail, also governments can inform better policies and investments. Next slide, please. Let me conclude with a preliminary update of the LPRM. As of September 2021, the LPRM is applied at 20 mine sites in 12 countries across Africa, South America, and Canada. And I'm pretty sure that there are more to come in the next reporting periods. And yeah, let me also say that the LPRM is already taken up by mining standards, such as the Initiative for Responsible Mining, IRMA, which aligned its standards guidance with the LPRM. And Rob also mentioned the EITI, like EITI Senegal. They all already included some of the LPRM's disclosures in their reporting. And I'm pretty sure that this is not the end of the LPRM success story. Next and last slide, please. Yeah, this is just the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention. For any questions, please reach out to our sector program, Extractors and Development, or to our partners from Mining Shared Value. And with this, I hand back to Jeff and looking forward to the discussion. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Johannes. It was fun to hear the LPRM talked about by someone else than myself for so long. So that was very good. And obviously, the whole point was to provide a practical tool to address the problems that Rob laid out. So really appreciate that. And that leads us to Mabola at the DAI. And I think, you know, if Rob has laid out the why and Johannes has laid out sort of a framework or a common reporting kind of target for everybody, I think what DAI has put together in terms of what you're working on is, you know, the next level of detail as to how do you actually manage this on the back end, right? The LPRM may be kind of an ingredients list as to what companies should be producing in terms of information, but you actually have sort of, you work with companies on the guts of actually local content strategies and measurement internally and managing better. So we're really excited to hear from you on your approach.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So my name is Mabola Sandy. Currently, I'm a project and product manager within DAI. DAI is an international development consultancy. Specifically, I work within the Sustainable Business Group at DAI, which has delivered local content, advisory, training, performance management activities to governments, donors, and multinationals around the world. As Jeff said, one of the ways in which we do this is through a software we've developed called the Supplier Management Portal. This was formerly called Local Content Plan and Report, but we're in the process of rebranding to include some improved features based on our experience. So the Supplier Management Portal, SMP, is a cloud-based software that can be configured to a variety of local content regulations or global standards, such as the mining local content reporting mechanism, which we've just reviewed, or just corporate strategies that extractive companies or companies in other industries have. The SMP provides an efficient way of collecting and analyzing local content performance information from across the supply chain, and also a means for sharing and reporting widely. The software collects data across procurement, workforce, training, capacity development, and social investment. And it really does the breakdown, as we saw in Johannes's presentation, of types of companies to really determine what value is being retained locally, or to what extent the value is retained locally. We're also currently in the process of expanding to include more of ESG metrics as well. Within the SMP software, we have an economic impact model that calculates direct, indirect, and induced impacts from local content activities as well. So I just wanted to set the scene and give you just like the background from which I will be covering in this presentation, just to share some insights and lessons learned from our experience as we've supported governments and operators in extractives to plan, report, and improve local content impacts and activities in a variety of regulatory environments. We've done this in several countries, including Kazakhstan, Sierra Leone, and Mexico. As we saw in Rob's presentation earlier, reporting local content still has some way to come. We still need to get better at coordinating data to make reporting more consistent, more useful, and more impactful. So on the following slides, I'll share 3 things that regulators, enforcers, facilitating bodies, all of us, in fact, can consider as we seek to promote good reporting practices and outcomes for, of course, the operators, supply chains, but eventually host communities and the countries that hold these resources. The first point really draws on the idea. You may have read the book or heard the TED Talk by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. And the basic premise of this book is that success that followed people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Steve Jobs was because they realized that people don't buy into a product or an idea until they understand why, the reason behind it. So for this reason, whenever we get the chance at DI, we ask our reporting companies, why do you report local content, or why don't you report local content? And I found that their answers are often extremely revealing. There's a range of answers that you can see on the graphic on the screen. And the answer given gives an indication of where a company is in their mindset. Are they on the resistance extreme, where they don't want to report, they don't see the value, they see it as complex or inefficient? Are they on a compliance mindset, where they do what they have to and nothing more? Or are they like fully committed, where they understand the value? Prioritizing local content, especially when it comes to performance management, can be very time-consuming, very expensive for companies. And of course, it's non-revenue generating as well as an activity. So it's easily deprioritized by businesses. So we often have a lot of work to do to convince them to even start looking at it. When it comes to reporting, we try to help companies understand why it's important to report data, why it's important the data is accurate. And in doing that, we also have to explain to them what the data is used for and how it benefits them. And as companies understand this, and as they buy into this, their response becomes even better, and that helps the whole performance management ecosystem to deliver the benefits that we're all looking out for: better informed policy, efficiencies, better socioeconomic community benefits, and so on. In a recent conversation with a company, a company in Sierra Leone, a mining company, they walked us through the journey they had taken from initially being resistant to now being very committed to local content and local content reporting. They told us that when the act in Sierra Leone, the Local Content Act, was introduced in 2016, in their words, it was like a joke. They just didn't take it seriously, didn't understand what it was. But as they began to comply, of course, they were mandated by the regulator to do this. As they started to do this, naturally they paid more attention and they realized that their efforts in developing local suppliers, recruiting local citizens, having social investments in the local community were resulting in benefits in terms of lower costs, shorter lead times, better reliability of goods and services, and also, of course, a happier community and a more engaged workforce. Seeing these benefits, they explained to us that they were encouraged encouraged into being committed truly to promoting local content. And it's been amazing to see this company go off their own initiative. They report more frequently than mandated by the law. And they've also dedicated resources to train their own supply chain partners, their suppliers and sub-suppliers, on implementing and reporting local content initiatives. So obviously, like a really good example here, but and we've heard this story several times. When managed well, we've seen that local content delivers tangible value to businesses. So as governing bodies, facilitators, we also need to start with why. From the big picture of why is local content important, globally on a big picture level, high level, down to the details of why do we need this specific metric that we're asking companies to report. Once we have these arguments down, we have examples, evidence, we can then clearly communicate to companies that we're trying to work with. And when we communicate, we need to do this in terms that the businesses can get excited about. You have to report because you have to report is not the most compelling reason to give any business. So, but communicating in a way that expresses the value in terms of cost, availability, transparency, license to operate, and so on is much more compelling. So that's really where, encouragement is for anyone trying to facilitate reporting. We've seen that it works. Starting with why, starting with the value is a very good idea. On the next slide, I'll look more at the process. So sometimes, even when we understand why we communicate the value, reporting is still challenging. It still has some pitfalls. And we've seen that for the success of any performance management regime, I think some of the earlier speakers spoke to this, the data needs to be as accurate as it can be. It needs to be complete as well. And of course, it needs to be on time to be of value, so that decisions can be made in a reasonable time frame. So when we're reporting, when we're encouraging companies to report, the requirements need to be made as clear as possible. Definitions, what is mandatory versus optional, what are the targets and timelines need to be spelled out very clearly to companies. The list also needs to be as concise as possible to ensure that we can focus and facilitate quality checking and analysis rather than having a deluge of data to look at. A quick example from our experience doing this work is we found that in one of the countries in the very first year of reporting, this was a few years ago, we had to request corrections and clarifications from over 80% of the companies that had reported. Obviously, you can imagine the cost, the time that this took, and also just the annoying level of repeat work. It's not ideal. And it really emphasized that guidance given to companies can never be too clear. And it needs to be, the more we can clarify, the more we can align and simplify definitions, the better. And also it's important to focus and boil down to essential requirements so as not to confuse or to overwhelm companies. Also discussed earlier as well, we see that companies have to report so many types of optional and mandatory types of reporting, from their annual reports, financial reporting, to ESG on several different levels, from international down to corporate. In fact, a survey found that managers spend an estimated 40% of time writing reports. This tells us that any efforts that we can make to be efficient and reduce this 40% should be encouraged. One of the advantages of the LPRM framework that Johannes just presented was that it allows reporting to take place through existing annual reporting websites and resources that companies have already produced. This creates really good efficiencies by building on work that has already been done, rather than creating a new set of parallel requirements that force companies to have to familiarize themselves with a whole new set of requirements. This is really important because, as you know, as facilitators ourselves at DI, we see new frameworks all the time, and unfortunately some of them don't account for reporting that already exists, and this results in tying companies down in spending even more time on reporting, which is not ideal. So the more we can reduce duplication, the better. And then just the final point, it sounds really simple, but one of the main causes of delays and poor reporting that we see in our work is companies telling us, oh, we didn't know the requirements, or the person who was responsible for this has now left, or they've moved departments. So this again emphasizes the importance of consistent, constant engagement with companies that need to provide data to ensure that they are as equipped as possible on the latest, and also wherever we have turnover, we're capturing whoever's joined newly and accounting for changes in management and things like that. To round up, I would take us back to sort of my opening point, which is as we end, the reporting cycle, we also need to go back to why. Why are we reporting? Why are we collecting all this data? It's not for its own sake, of course. We want to achieve value. We want to drive well-informed decisions. We want to have all the benefits that we've talked about earlier, better transparency, cost reduction, and so on. However, in this pie chart, you can see the results of a survey that was done by Deloitte that showed that only 24% of time spent on management reporting goes to analysis and acting upon the figures. We don't have a survey for local content reporting specifically, but in my experience and in doing this work of reporting over the last few years, I think it's maybe even less than this for local content. And it is the area that is in need of most improvement in local content reporting, in my opinion. It's the analysis and acting on it. I've heard repeatedly from companies that they would love to hear how they can improve, how they benchmark, how they're performing against perhaps other countries or other players in their industry. And it's really obvious that many of the reports and recommendations that our team writes for clients are not shared in a timely manner down the chain, even to those who are providing the data. Perhaps this is down to competing priorities, time commitment, and so on. But there really is a need for solutions that reduce the time spent on gathering, checking, quality analysis of data, and increase the time that we spend on generating insights, sharing recommendations, and most importantly, acting on these recommendations to achieve long-term changes, long-term improvements. So this is something that we spend a lot of our time thinking about and working on at DAI, and it's a big part of why we've recently improved our reporting software. We've made it more efficient by reducing the time to gather and quality check data, by just making the interface a lot more friendly, a lot more easy to standardize and collect data directly from players through the supply chain. But importantly, we've also integrated it with one of our software development, supply chain development softwares to facilitate the design and implementation of supply chain development initiatives that basically act on the recommendations that we get from the data. So all in all, we need coordination from partners to make sure that our efforts in reporting link to actions to improve transparency, derive economic benefits, achieve diversification of economies, and also support initiatives like the energy transition as well for the overall benefit of our host communities. So with that, I'll bring it to a close and look forward to the question and answer session we have coming up. And feel free to get in touch as well to discuss any of the, always happy to discuss local content.
Great, thanks so much, Mobola. I'm going to hand it over to Javier Aguilar at the World Bank just to provide a few comments and reflections on the presentations. But you know, while he's doing that, I think if people would like to put up their hand if they'd like to ask a question, and also for that matter, you can start putting your questions in the chat. And then once Javier is spoken, we can dive into the Q&A and moderate that.
Many thanks, Jeff. And do you hear me clear?
Yes, good.
Good. And many thanks to the presenters. Interesting presentations. I just want to maybe share a couple of ideas so that we can get into the Q&A, and hopefully we can get also more comments by the presenters. I really like to start from the question why the local content reporting is important, and it's really the way that it's really becoming more and more important is that companies, at the individual companies, at the industry level, the mining industry, and governments promoting mining activity, they really need they can find on local content reporting a way of demonstrating, showing that the industry creates value, not just for shareholders, but for stakeholders. And most importantly, if those stakeholders are local. In this way, I think Robert mentioned the importance of transparency on suppliers, calling our attention to suppliers' corruption, and also the risk of capture by local elites on the opportunities for local business. So in that way, maybe we should also consider a little bit more some kind of inclusive local content, and not just local content by the sake of having a business with national or local enterprises, but also that this can be broadly open for opportunities for other local suppliers, and not just for the big national firms or corporations. On the Johannes presentation, I think the LPRM, it's interesting, getting more interest by companies, and many of them applying it at the individual level. And it came to my mind a question when Johannes mentioned the LPRM as an initiative, and that may be related to the EITI. It's interesting because, as you know, EITI is trying to transitioning from being an initiative towards being kind of more like relying on government systems and how the government reports. And in terms of local content, it might be better to take the shortcut and learn from that lesson, that it's really important to maybe work with regulators on adapting or developing their own regulatory or national system for local content reporting. And in that way, also the importance of regulators to take the lead on defining what are the parameters under which companies should report. And companies always can go beyond that, but it's really relevant to have own monitoring and evaluation systems, and also key performance indicators defined by the government. And presentation by Mobile, interesting on the supplier management portal, and I like this idea of the the motivation for local content reporting, going from resistance, compliance, and commitment. And it also came up more a reflection from what she presented in terms of thinking about local content reporting as a moving target, because now we see that while many countries, companies are trying to improve their systems for measuring and reporting local content, all the changes, innovations, and technology are telling us that we may need to go beyond the mining value chain. So I think there's a new challenge in terms of helping governments and companies also to measure local value creation. So that meaning generation of employment, generation of local business, but not just within the mining value chain through suppliers, but beyond that, in maybe other local value chains, because there are already companies, for example, Anglo presented the other day, that they're going to start measuring a target. I think it was maybe that they set a target that for each employment that they help to generate in the mining value chain, they may try to help and to generate 5 additional employments outside the mining value chain. So with that, I think there might be further reflections on that, but many thanks for the presenters, and yeah, let's move on the Q&A. Thanks, Jeff.
Great, thanks so much for those reflections, and I think they're great tie-ins to the questions that are already coming in. So as a reminder, you can put questions in the chat and also put your hand up. We've already got a couple teed up, so we'll dive into that. Thomas Deed asked about there needs to be company benefit in order to to drive local content and local procurement and cost savings. So his question is, what would you estimate the savings are for companies moving to local procurement? So I think that might be best answered a little bit by Mabola in terms of some of your experience working with companies and what cost savings they may have uncovered moving to local. And for that matter, I think Rob, you could probably chime in on the cost control and the role of transparency and local procurement there.
Yes, Jeff. So just to repeat, the question is around what cost efficiencies companies have gained from going local.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So a major area we see is in like workforce. That's a big part of it, because if we compare the cost of expat labor to local labor, there's often a very clear disparity due to expats often paid higher salaries, but also need associated benefits like housing, relocation, and so on, and travel, of course. Having someone locally available is much more beneficial. And it's not just cost. Actually, we saw over the COVID period that a lot of expat workforce had to move. They couldn't travel into country, so there were benefits actually. It's not just upfront costs. I mean, there were benefits actually by having people locally available that could, get work going during the pandemic. Companies that had invested prior, we heard from some of them, benefited so much more because people were already developed locally to step in. And of course, from the procurement point of view as well, it's locally available goods sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes are cheaper due to fewer transportation costs, perhaps disparity again in the cost of labor imported versus local goods, and of the lack of import taxes and things like that sometimes make local goods more available. And also there is a benefit in terms of reliability, delays, and so on, especially in certain jurisdictions where you have perhaps unpredictable customs procedures or transportation lead times and so on. So those were like a couple of basic examples, and a lot of the benefits that we see companies reporting are really around those 2 major areas. It's direct costs of labor and goods and services, but also indirect cost benefits from time saved and reliability as well from both of these areas.
I don't know, Rob, if you have anything to add, or I can go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to say in any precise way. You know what we think the savings would be. I think though that just the important point I would want to make here is just like if you sort of add some sort of sunlight and scrutiny into an area of behavior, I think that people make, you know, it forces the decision making to generally be of a higher quality. So that's one point I'd like to make. I don't know if this is the right moment to make the second point, but I'm going to make it anyway. I think as well that we need to, when we're talking about sort of local content, we need to be clear that, you know, we're not like that's quite a sort of amorphous sort of subject, and I think this has come up a few times, but I think it's a point that's worth making. Like, the way you define local has huge impacts, and so some sort of local content probably does lead to huge cost savings, while other local content doesn't. And this is why we need to be transparent about it. We need to be clear about the definitions, so we are able to scrutinize whether or not we're even using the, you know, we're aiming at the right thing. And so that's another level I'd like to add on to that.
Great. Thanks so much. And then that's actually a great transition to the next question. Our colleague Dan Lemmy at the African Development Bank asked, you know, how much does the ease of you know, general business environment in host countries affect whether you can use local suppliers to begin with, which obviously is a huge issue in terms of trying to make local procurement work. But then secondly, how can the tool, and I think he's referring to the mining LPRM, but I think in general, you know, how can tracking tools and softwares like DAIs be used to advocate for support for better business environment for suppliers? I don't know if Johannes, maybe you want to take that one on, or
just to briefly touch on the question before, if I may. Yeah. Because if you talk about cost savings of going local, I think it's also important that the point Rob mentioned, when you talk about skills and employment, you have a huge change these days of the required skills with more technology, confusing the words, that you don't need easy skilled workers anymore. So it's also an investment, a long-term investment by mining companies to skill their workforce. So just that remark. Sorry. And the second question, could you please repeat that? Sorry.
Just about what is the role of the general business environment affecting local procurement in the first place, and what does the role of transparency and tools and frameworks have in helping us advocate for improvements in the business environment?
Yeah, I think first of all, I mean, this tool is quite important for companies. I mean, companies are applying that tool, but it's also important for governments, because they can make or improve their policy making after a standardized reporting has taken place. And I know that there are some projects also going on, especially I have one in mind from GIZ, working in Cote d'Ivoire on a local content project, where we also try to pilot how collecting information from several companies using the LPRM can improve policy making in the long run.
Great. Anyone else want to jump on that question?
Yeah, if it's okay, I have a couple of thoughts on that second question. You know, how can tools be used to advocate for a better business environment? I think firstly, by making sure that the information that they produce is made public. One thing about the whole area of local procurement and local content is that there isn't in a lot of countries, a lot of jurisdictions, there isn't much data and actual information to make, you know, evidence-based policy decisions on. And so making sure that that data is out there in a way that, you know, think tanks and others can sort of scrutinize and get their hands on and come up with sort of ideas, I think is a really important you know, step that can be taken. And, you know, just as well, sort of making sure that people understand sort of local markets, research on that kind of thing is really helpful. I've seen some really, you know, interesting examples in Tanzania. I think it's Professor Sutton from LSE produced these just these very basic sort of directories of local companies, and you know, they just list sort of like, here's like 10 companies in each sort of sector, like that provide, you know, these kinds of products that you might want. It's such a simple thing, but it's really transformational in you know, providing sort of an allowing companies to understand what their options are. So, you know, the fact that something like that is so transformational just, you know, shows us like how limited the information is in so many of these environments. So yeah, just get the information out there.
Both?
Yeah. So just to add to that, Rob's what Rob was saying just now, we've seen in DI like the biggest barrier in a lot of countries is well, apart from the will to do these things, once we've conquered the will, the motivation, is the information asymmetry. Multinationals not being aware of what's available locally, and local businesses not being aware of what the multinationals are doing or how to work with them. And so anything that we can do to facilitate that is always a benefit. And of course, what we have now is the benefit of most of the world being connected on mobile to the internet. Most people yeah, having access to, you know, if you have an online database, most people now can access, or many people now can access it. So we've found that software is a really good way of plugging that informational gap to bring people together. And yes, Rob was saying, so much sort of stems from that, from connections, joint ventures, partnerships, and so on. And so the list is sort of endless, employment opportunities, and so on, just by having the information available and allowing people connect.
Great. We've got a question here from Nina, who's asking about sort of government best practice in promoting local content. Sort of ask two questions. What are some best practices for governments to support the development of local procurement capacity? And then likewise, you know, what are some of the roles that governments can play besides fixing targets, which he's pointed out sometimes can be counterproductive. So what are some of the roles the governments can play? And I suppose, you know, if you want to, in your answer, you can always draw back to you know, the role of reporting and measurement in that as well.
I can go here. One thing that this came directly from companies. I spoke to a few companies a couple of months ago, and apart from setting targets, governments can help them sell the advantages from help them promote their businesses where they have used local content. And I explained, like, we have some countries where, or some goods and services where it is maybe a bit more expensive to go local, but there are other benefits, and companies do go local. They use local workforce or local goods and services, but then aren't successful in selling them because then they're a bit more expensive. And the companies were like, look, we have this challenge. We see the benefit in local content, but it would be helpful if we have maybe some support to market or to link us to businesses, or maybe some sort of campaigns from the government to promote the benefits to the wider economy as we see them. We see the benefit. We want everyone else to see the benefit. So those are sort of, anything to facilitate or to promote the local content message is useful to businesses. And I think, yeah, in addition to setting targets and kind of being the enforcer, governments can also facilitate a bit more to help companies, when they have done local content, they've done it well, help them to actually reap the benefits from it.
Anyway, any other takers?
Sure. I mean, on this point of setting targets, I think the very important thing here is to be very clear about the process, and then also say what the targets are once they're out there. Again, like, it's important about linking those to actual definitions, and making sure that discretionary decision making is taken out, and that is in part by making sure that the targets are concrete and verifiable in some way, and that needs to be tailored to the capacity of the regulatory authorities, etc., or whoever's overseeing it. And then I think the other thing is just to make sure that those targets are reported on, and once they're out there, and that's done in a systematic way, again, that is transparent, and that there's some real accountability there. And there are different ways that this can be done. In Brazil or South Africa, they bring in the auditors to do this kind of thing. So that's one approach. I mean, in sort of an environment where there's sort of quite a lot of sort of local, strong local capacity. In others, you might have to rely a bit more on more simple sort of targets, simple definitions that are more easily verifiable where there's lower capacity. And then the other, there are loads of good examples of interesting sort of reporting protocols. One that I have in mind is the Rondas Mexico portal for the petroleum, the private sector sort of petroleum licenses in Mexico. They have on each block, they have a page on local procurement spending, including the target against a number of categories, and then whether or not that target was achieved, and that's updated on an ongoing basis per quarter.
I think you're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry, that was well. It's gonna happen sooner or later. I'll go to another question in the chat, but just really quickly that certainly we've seen that those examples that Rob just talked about are really fantastic, because so many of the local content pushes, particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa, have been made with big fanfare, but there hasn't been this follow-up in terms of actual measurement and sort of coming back to saying, what was the result 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, and that doesn't really lead to accountability. So I think that it's really important to have these tools. Thomas asked another question, and I think it's really good. And it speaks a bit to what Johannes was talking about in terms of the Teranga Gold reporting example. But what's going on is we're moving from the discussion of local content to value add, and you're wondering what the panelists' thoughts are on this value addition point when it comes to obviously measurement and reporting. And again, the Senegal example is one where they've broken down the spending into where there actually is value creation in the host country by a nationally owned company versus just a subsidiary of an international company. So I think there's lots of roles measurement can play in this. Any takers?
I mean, I can take that. Also, yeah. I'm afraid I would repeat some of the points you just mentioned, Jeff, because I mean, what the APRM does is trying to split up the procurement in general by categories, and also by origin, so that you split up between local and national subsidiaries. So that's the point, the LPRM, and then you can see what the value added is on a national basis, and also see if that is kept in the country, if that stays in the country. And that was more or less the matrix I was showing in my presentation. And supplier D, being a local manufacturer or service provider, is providing the largest value addition.
And just to chime in, I think this it can fall within the process of defining. When you say define local content, it can fall within that. One thing that we do is look at goods and services procurement, and within goods, actually, not just look at who did you buy it from, but if you're buying a, finished good from a local supplier, understanding that the local value add from that is really not that much. Maybe, what's retained locally is maybe a bit of profit, maybe a bit of transportation, and that's it. So actually going into the detail when reporting to define to companies, we're trying to understand what, try and understand what is the good and service you're buying, and what portion of that came from, came from abroad, came from somewhere else. But it goes down to the point on defining what we mean by local content. Do we mean local suppliers? You might want to look at that. Do we mean the number of local suppliers? Do we mean the spend with them? Or do we actually mean the what are the goods and services? And within those goods and services, what comes from where? And you have some really good I know Brazil has some really good formulas for calculating this. We have some in Sierra Leone as well, where we split them granularly. But of course, I would say like the risk with this is that when we get granular, it takes more time, more effort. So we need to make sure that we're able to back that up with adequate resources from whoever the regulator or the overseeing body is, to make sure that we can support companies through calculating, and also actually like review that information as well, making sure it's credible.
Great point. Rob, do you have anything to add on that one? If not, that's fine. But
that was a shake of the head, no.
oh, okay, great. Well, yes, and I think it's absolutely correct that the time it takes to put these together is a big challenge. And one of the biggest challenges we've seen is, you can't, you want to know how many jobs the suppliers are creating themselves, but you don't want to put a small supplier in a position where they're filling out questionnaires constantly about how many employees they have and where they're buying their products from. So it's a huge balance for sure. It's one of the big problems that we face. And even if you do want to do imported versus not imported, I mean, what is something could be imported of finished, or it could be two products that you just stick together, and that's technically manufactured locally, but so that's a very difficult to measure kind of thing. So we have one more question. I think it's a good transition sort of to the end, and also for the sake of our next webinar, which is going to be continuing our series on the green transition, which is to say what role does local content play in the green transition, and how this efforts to increase local procurement can ultimately support efforts at green transition.
I'm happy to take an initial stab at that.
Go ahead.
So I think that there are a couple of different things going on in the mining sector. I think that there is, projected to be, and we're already beginning to see it on some commodities, a boom of critical minerals that are required for sort of clean electricity and various other sort of aspects of the new economy. And I think that making sure, we as before, we want to make sure as much of that value in taking those minerals out of the ground goes to local communities, and I think that's going to be increasingly important going forward. And so, you know, this is a big moment to get things right, and get those sort of structures in place now, because, you know, we're ahead of a wave of new investment. So that's what I'd say on the mining sector. On the petroleum sector, we're seeing something, you know, probably quite a different scenario. A sector that will eventually be declining, and there will be probably fewer and maybe not many at all new investments. And I think here probably the reason we want to be reporting on these things is to understand the wider benefits of these projects on other stakeholders, to understand, you know, as petroleum extraction sort of dwindles down, you know, how can we make sure that communities and other sort of supply and ecosystems of suppliers, etc., aren't just sort of stranded along with the assets that they serve. So there's a couple of ideas, but I do think that this is going to be a very important issue going forward, and important to justify projects.
Yeah, on the last point, if I may, I think there the keyword is just transition that we have in the fossil sector, with the phasing out of oil, gas, coal. We need to find alternative sources of income for people, and this is the justification for a good mapping, good data that we need in order to create and develop new industry sectors and new jobs, reskill people, and so on. But I think that's a huge topic for maybe another webinar, the just transition.
Yeah, and I have, you know, an example of this from Senegal, who are sort of at the beginning of from oil and gas, their oil and gas journey, and the National Institute for Oil and Gas institutional training and development out there, they had to consider this problem. We don't want to train a bunch of people up for oil and gas, and in however many years' time, they're all very skilled in oil and gas, but not useful for the energy transition, which is also a priority. And for them, the decision it played into their design of training programs, of development programs for suppliers and for individuals, to make sure that skills were transferable, and that you know, it was built in from the beginning, basically. But from that experience, I think it's really important, you know, to, yes, make data-driven decisions, but also make that decision of optimizing where we choose to place focus in our oil and gas, in our extractive development initiatives. So as we do our analysis of local content, which goods and services we prioritize, or which skills we prioritize, we factor in the energy transition into that, knowing that some of these areas could be affected for better or for worse, as Rob just gave the overview. But I think the important thing is just bearing it in mind as we develop and design initiatives to improve local content, because it will just make sure it's accounted for from the beginning, where we have stand.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We've just got a minute left, so I think we'll use this opportunity to wrap up. I've put, for those who are attending but are not a member yet of the ELLED community practice, I've put Kyla DeWorth's email address, where you can email to request membership. Kyla is on our team and frankly does so much of the work that you don't see behind the scenes. We will be aiming to have another webinar in about a month's time, actually on the green transition, as I mentioned. So it'll be a great transition from this webinar in terms of the role of local content and that topic. And we'll be putting a summary of this on the COP itself soon, and it'll be featured in the next newsletter. So with that, I want to thank our presenters. It was a really great discussion today, and of course, thank the bank for hosting this. And we hope you all have a great day and are keeping safe. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye.